My wife started betraying me behind my back while I was spending time raising our daughter. When she left me, I found someone else and got married, and our daughter made her choice. In the early 2000s, social media began its rapid rise, becoming an essential part of daily life for millions. The number of accounts grew exponentially, and soon, billions of users were signed up across various platforms. Despite their overwhelming popularity, not everyone was convinced. For people like me, there just wasn't any draw to these online spaces. I valued face-to-face conversations and phone calls with close friends and family, which felt more genuine than interacting through a screen. Still, the surge of social media was impossible to ignore, and it wasn't long before my own household was touched by it. My teenage daughter, Evelyn, had been talking about joining ever since she turned 13, eager to connect with her friends in this new digital world. My wife, Sarah, was open to the idea and eventually allowed Evelyn to create an account. I, however, had my doubts. I trusted Sarah's judgment, but I couldn't shake my concerns about the safety and authenticity of these platforms, particularly for young girls like Evelyn. It wasn't long before Evelyn started urging Sarah and me to join as well. She brought it up one night during dinner, bubbling with excitement. "Mom, Dad, you should totally get accounts. It's fun. You can keep up with your friends, and there are games you can play too." Sarah, always enthusiastic about staying connected, smiled and said, "Sure, why not? It sounds like fun." I wasn't so easily convinced. "No thanks," I said, shrugging, hoping that would end the discussion. "I already talked to my friends on the phone, and if I want to play games, we've got plenty here at home." I wasn't about to be roped into something I had no interest in, but Evelyn wasn't about to give up. "But, Dad," she persisted, "what about Aunt Linda? When's the last time you talked to her?" Caught off guard, I had to think for a moment. A few weeks ago, I guess." "Well, did you know she got a new car?" Evelyn said, her eyes bright with excitement. "It's red, and Beth's going to get her old car when she gets her license in a few months." I blinked, surprised. "Really? I didn't know. I thought her old car was still in great shape." Evelyn grinned, clearly enjoying having the upper hand in this conversation. "See, Dad, you're missing out. If you were on social media, you'd know these things." Sarah chuckled, enjoying the playful banter between us. That night, as we cleaned up after dinner, Sarah brought it up again. "Maybe Evelyn has a point. It could be a nice way to keep in touch with family and some of her old friends." I wasn't as easily swayed. "I don't know, Sarah. I'm not sure I really want to reconnect with most of them. I already keep in touch with the people who matter." While I had maintained friendships with some of my male friends over the years, my experiences with women during high school and college weren't exactly fond memories. In high school, I was often treated as an immature younger brother, someone not taken seriously. College wasn't much better at first, though I eventually made a few female friends and even had a couple of girlfriends in my later years. But still, reconnecting with people from that era wasn't exactly appealing to me. However, after some consideration, and perhaps out of a sense of obligation to monitor Evelyn's online activity, I reluctantly agreed to create an account. I wanted to ensure she was safe. After all, the horror stories I'd heard about predators and scams on social media haunted me, and I wasn't about to let my daughter fall into any traps. So, under the guise of reconnecting with old friends, I signed up. Secretly, though, my real goal was to keep an eye on her. As I started exploring the platform, I found myself surprised by how many people I actually recognized from the past. Some old college friends, former coworkers, and even a few high school classmates were active. At first, I kept things simple. No deep conversations, just quick greetings and the occasional check-in. I was careful not to interact with anyone who might stir up trouble, especially old flames. Sarah and I had been married for nearly 2 decades, and while our marriage wasn't perfect, I wasn't about to jeopardize what we had by rekindling past relationships. But then, I stumbled across Maria. She had been one of the few female friends I was close with during college, particularly in my freshman and sophomore years. I had harbored a secret crush on her for a long time, but I never acted on it because I didn't want to ruin our friendship. Besides, by the time I gathered the courage to tell her how I felt, we had drifted apart. By then, I was dating other girls, and Maria had changed majors, leading us down different paths. Still, The thought of reconnecting with her as a mature adult was intriguing. Without overthinking it, I sent her a friend request and a brief message. I figured it would be nice to catch up, no strings attached. A few days later, her response came, and it wasn't what I expected. "I'm sorry, but I don't recall ever knowing anyone by that name. You must have mistaken me for someone else." The message was like a punch to the gut. Did she really not remember me? Had I meant so little to her that my name didn't even ring a bell? I stared at the screen, dumbfounded. For a moment, I considered not replying. But then, I decided she must be joking. Maria had always had a dry sense of humor, so I sent her a playful reply. "Nice one, Maria. You almost had me there. How have you been?" I waited, hoping she would laugh it off and we could get back to chatting. But when her next message arrived, the joke was clearly on me. "I'm serious," she wrote. "I really don't remember you. You must have the wrong person." I was floored. We had shared so many memories, classes, parties, long talks about life and the future. How could she not remember me at all? I decided to jog her memory with a specific event. I reminded her of the time we had gone to a Delta Lambda party with our friends Mark and Christy. Maria had sprained her ankle that night, and I had carried her back to her dorm on my back. We'd spent the rest of the night icing her ankle and laughing about the situation. A week later, she responded, "Sorry, but you've got the wrong person. I've never sprained my ankle like that, and I wouldn't promise anyone a back massage unless they were a very close boyfriend. Please don't contact me again." That final message stung. I felt a mix of embarrassment, frustration, and sadness. How could someone who had once been so important in my life now have no recollection of me? I knew I needed to let it go, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling of loss. In a final message, I apologized for bothering her and said I wouldn't reach out again. I attached a photo from one of our college parties, hoping it would trigger some recognition, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. That night, I put my old college photo album back in the basement and resolved to be more careful about reconnecting with people from my past. It wasn't worth the heartache. Meanwhile, things at home were starting to unravel in ways I hadn't anticipated. While I was focused on keeping tabs on Evelyn's online presence and dealing with my own unresolved feelings about Maria, Sarah was reconnecting with an ex-boyfriend during a business trip to Chicago. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, we both had people from our pasts we occasionally spoke to. But when Sarah's behavior started changing, becoming more distant and secretive, I grew suspicious. One night, after she came home late from work, I confronted her. What followed was a confession I hadn't been prepared for. She had reconnected with her ex and had been seeing him on and off for months. The trust we had built over nearly 2 decades crumbled in an instant. I was heartbroken, but more than anything, I was angry. How could she throw away everything we had? Everything we had built together, for a fleeting connection with someone from her past. The divorce wasn't immediate, but the writing was on the wall. Sarah moved out a few months later, and Evelyn was devastated. She was forced to split her time between us, spending half her time at Sarah's place and half at mine. It was a difficult adjustment for all of us, but in the end, Evelyn handled it better than I had expected. She grew into a strong, independent young woman, and while the situation was far from ideal, I was proud of how she navigated it. As for me, it took time to recover from the betrayal. I went through the motions, focusing on my work and on being the best father I could be for Evelyn. I dated occasionally, but nothing serious. I wasn't ready to let anyone in after what had happened with Sarah. Trust was something I no longer gave freely, and I wasn't sure if I ever would again. 7 years passed before I got another unexpected phone call from an old friend, Andy Reiner, one of my closest buddies from college. We had kept in touch sporadically over the years, exchanging Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, but we hadn't spoken much lately. When Andy called, he had news about our upcoming 25-year class reunion. "Tom, can you believe it's been 25 years? Gloria and I are thinking about going to the reunion, but we don't want to be stuck sitting with strangers. You should come. Mark, Keith, and Gabby are all going too. It'll be a great group." I hesitated. I had skipped the 20-year reunion for obvious reasons. My divorce was fresh, and I hadn't been in the mood to face old friends and their inevitable questions. But now, with 7 years of distance and healing, I found myself considering it. "Yeah, Count me in, I said, surprising even myself. I'll register tonight. As soon as I hung up with Andy, I followed through on my promise and registered for the reunion. I even bought tickets to the homecoming game. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of excitement about reconnecting with old friends, even if I was still a little wary of what might come up. The months passed quickly, and before I knew it, reunion weekend had arrived. 10 of us from our close circle had committed to attending, and Mark and I were the only ones who were still single. Many of our friends had remarried after divorcing their first spouses, but not Mark. He had never married. That Friday night, a group of us met for dinner and drinks at the hotel bar. Mark and I reminisced about our college days, sharing stories with our friends and catching up on each other's lives. The next day, we attended campus tours and seminars, marveling at how much the university had changed while still retaining its familiar charm. Later that afternoon, we decided to grab lunch at a pizza place near campus, a spot that had been a favorite of ours during college. The place had changed ownership since our time, but we were curious to see if the pizza still tasted the same. As we waited for our food, I noticed familiar faces from the reunion crowd trickling in. It seemed we weren't the only ones who had the idea to revisit our old hangout. Josh and Stephanie, who had recently sold their company and traveled across Europe, joined us at our table, regaling us with stories from their travels. Gloria was deep in conversation with another couple about her upcoming book, and Mark excused himself when he spotted Jane Muir, a woman he had had a crush on during our freshman year. It was odd, watching all these connections and reconnections unfold around me. The last time I had been at a reunion, I was fresh out of college, eager to make a mark in the world. Now, we were all in our late 40s, many of us remarried, raising teenagers or sending our kids off to college. I couldn't help but feel a mix of nostalgia and melancholy, realizing how much had changed. That evening, we attended the official reunion dinner. The event was held in a grand ballroom, and as we sat through the speeches, I found myself zoning out. I glanced around the room, my gaze scanning the familiar faces, wondering what stories lay behind the carefully crafted smiles. It wasn't long before the speeches concluded and the music began. Couples and friends took to the dance floor, and I made my way around the room, chatting with old classmates. As I stood at the bar, ordering a drink, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around, and my heart skipped a beat. Maria stood there, looking as beautiful as ever, though there were more lines on her face now, signs of the years that had passed. Her smile was hesitant, as if she wasn't sure how I would react to seeing her again. "Hi, Tom," she said softly. "Do you remember me?" I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Of course, I do, Maria. How have you been?" She looked down at the ground for a moment before meeting my gaze again. "It's been a while. Mind if we catch up for a bit?" I motioned toward a quiet corner of the room, and we found a couple of chairs where we could sit and talk without the noise of the party around us. It had been nearly a decade since our last exchange, the one where she had pretended not to know me. I wasn't sure if I was ready to reopen that chapter of my life, but here we were. "So," I began, trying to keep the conversation light, "what have you been up to since we last talked?" Maria sighed, her expression serious. "Tom, before we go any further, I need to apologize for what happened back then. I wasn't honest with you, and I owe you an explanation." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Apology? For what?" "For pretending not to know you," she admitted. "When you reached out to me years ago," I panicked. At the time, I was still married to Vince, and things between us were complicated. He was very jealous, and I knew if he found out I was reconnecting with old friends, especially male friends, it would cause problems. So, I pretended not to know you. It was easier than trying to explain. I sat back, processing her words. "That's why you said you didn't remember me?" She nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "I hated doing it, but I didn't know what else to do. Things between Vince and me were falling apart, and I wasn't ready to deal with the fallout. I'm sorry, Tom. I really am." I wasn't sure how to respond. On one hand, it was a relief to know that she hadn't truly forgotten me, that our memories together hadn't been as insignificant as her earlier messages had suggested. But on the other hand, her explanation didn't erase the hurt I had felt at the time. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. You could have explained the situation. I would have understood. Maria looked away, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I was afraid. Afraid of how Vince would react, afraid of what you would think of me. I didn't handle it well, and I regret it. That's why I'm telling you now. I let out a long breath, leaning back in my chair. Well, it's in the past now. I appreciate you telling me the truth, even if it took this long. She gave me a small, sad smile. Thanks, Tom. I'm glad we can finally talk about it. For a moment, we sat in silence, the hum of the reunion party continuing in the background. I wasn't sure where the conversation would go from here, but I was glad we had cleared the air. It felt like a weight had been lifted, even if I still wasn't sure what to make of it all. So, how are things now? I asked, curious about how her life had unfolded since those years. Maria sighed again. Vince and I divorced about 3 years ago. It was a long time coming, but we finally went through with it after our son started college. We're on decent terms now, I suppose, but we barely talk unless it's about our son. I nodded, understanding the complexity of divorce all too well. That sounds rough. I've been there too. Sarah and I divorced 7 years ago. Maria's eyes widened slightly in surprise. I didn't know that. I'm sorry. I shrugged. It happens. She reconnected with an old boyfriend during a business trip, and that was the beginning of the end. Evelyn, our daughter, was heartbroken at first, but she's grown into a strong, independent young woman. I'm proud of her. Maria smiled at the mention of my daughter. That's wonderful. I always knew you'd be a great dad. We spent the next hour catching up on our lives, sharing stories of our children, our careers, and the ups and downs of the past decade. It felt strangely comfortable, like slipping back into an old friendship. But there was also a sense of caution, a lingering hesitation on both sides. We had hurt each other in different ways over the years, and while the conversation was pleasant, there was an unspoken understanding that we couldn't go back to what we once were. As the evening wore on, we found ourselves back on the dance floor. The band was playing slow, nostalgic songs from our college days, and as we danced, Maria leaned in close, her head resting on my shoulder. For a moment, I let myself get lost in the music and the warmth of her presence. It was tempting, so tempting, to fall back into old patterns, to rekindle what we had once shared. But then, as the song came to an end, reality set in. This was a reunion, not a second chance at the past. We had both moved on, lived our lives, made mistakes, and learned from them. I couldn't ignore the fact that while the past had shaped us, it didn't define us. We were different people now. As the night wound down, Maria and I walked out into the cool night air, standing under the soft glow of the streetlights outside the ballroom. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Tom, she began hesitantly, do you ever think about what could have been? About us? I met her gaze, my heart heavy with the weight of the past. Yeah, sometimes. But I try not to dwell on it too much. We were good friends, Maria, but we were also young and figuring things out. If things had been different, maybe. But life took us in other directions. She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. I know. I've wondered, what it would have been like if we had taken a chance. I smiled, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. We all wonder about that sometimes. But I don't think it would have worked out the way we imagine. Things happen for a reason, and I think we're both where we need to be now. Maria seemed to mull over my words for a moment before sighing softly. You're right. I guess I just needed to hear that. We stood there in the quiet for a few more moments, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye. But eventually, Maria stepped closer, reaching up to give me a gentle hug. I'm really glad we got to talk, she whispered, her breath warm against my ear. Thank you, Tom. I hugged her back, the embrace filled with both affection and finality. Take care of yourself, Maria. I wish you all the best. She pulled back, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, but she smiled. You too. With that, we parted ways. I watched her walk down the street, her figure fading into the distance, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of closure. The chapter with Maria was finally over, and it was time to move forward. As I walked back to my hotel, I thought about the journey I had been on since college. The friendships, the heartbreaks, the lessons learned along the way. Life had taken me down paths I hadn't expected, but I had come out stronger on the other side. The next morning, I met up with Mark, Andy, and the rest of our group for breakfast. We laughed, shared stories from the night before, and reminisced about the good old days. There was something comforting about being surrounded by old friends, people who had seen me at my best and my worst and still accepted me. As we said our goodbyes and made promises to keep in touch, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the memories, the lessons, and even the heartaches. They had all shaped me into the person I was today. And while I didn't know what the future held, I was ready to face it with an open heart and a renewed sense of optimism. Perhaps, somewhere down the road, new adventures and new connections awaited me. And this time, I wouldn't be looking back. I'd be looking forward. Life after the reunion settled back into a familiar routine. I returned to Dallas with a sense of peace and closure that had eluded me for years. The encounter with Maria had stirred up old emotions, but in the end, it had also allowed me to close a chapter that had remained open for far too long. I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted, and I was finally ready to move forward. Back home, Evelyn was visiting me for the weekend. She had grown into a remarkable young woman, intelligent, kind, and fiercely independent. At 21, she was in her final year of college, studying veterinary medicine, a path she had been passionate about since she was a child. I couldn't have been prouder of the person she had become, especially given everything she had endured during my divorce from Sarah. That Saturday afternoon, as we sat in the backyard, enjoying the crisp fall air, Evelyn glanced at me, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "You seem different, Dad. More relaxed. What happened at the reunion?" I chuckled, shaking my head. I don't know if I'd call it relaxed, but I guess you could say I found some closure. "Closure?" she asked, tilting her head in curiosity. "Yeah," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You remember Maria, right? The woman I reconnected with years ago?" Evelyn nodded. "Of course. She's the one who pretended not to remember you, right?" "That's the one," I confirmed. "Well, I saw her at the reunion. We talked, cleared the air. Turns out, she was lying back then because she was afraid of her jealous husband. We caught up and it was good. But I realized something. Sometimes the past is better left in the past." Evelyn looked thoughtful, her brow furrowing slightly. "Do you still have feelings for her?" I considered the question carefully before answering. I did, for a long time. But not anymore. Seeing her again made me realize that whatever we might have had is long gone. It's like a memory, something I can look back on fondly, but it's not something I want to bring into the present. I'm ready to move on. Evelyn smiled, a glint of pride in her eyes. "I'm glad, Dad. You deserve to be happy." "I am happy," I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "Especially with you around." We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about her future plans, her upcoming exams, and the internship she had lined up at a local animal clinic. I could see how excited she was about the direction her life was taking, and it filled me with a sense of contentment. I had done my best to raise her well, and seeing her thrive was the greatest reward I could ask for. As the sun began to set, Evelyn asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about dating again, Dad?" I blinked, surprised by the question. "Dating?" "Yeah," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes were focused intently on me. "I mean, it's been a while since you and Mom split up, and you're still young. Don't you think it's time to put yourself out there?" I hesitated. Dating hadn't been a priority for me since the divorce. Sure, I had gone on a few dates here and there, but nothing serious. The idea of diving back into the world of relationships had always seemed daunting. But now, with Evelyn growing up and carving out her own life, I found myself considering it more seriously. "I don't know," I admitted. "It's been a long time, and I'm not sure I'm ready for all that again." Evelyn smiled, her expression soft. "I think you're ready, Dad. And whoever ends up with you is going to be really lucky." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Well, we'll see. Maybe I'll give it a try, but no promises." She laughed, clearly satisfied with my answer. "That's all I ask. Just give it a try." The next few weeks passed quietly, but Evelyn's words lingered in my mind. I started thinking more about what it would be like to date again, to meet someone new, to share my life with someone once more. I wasn't sure if I was ready to take the plunge, but the idea was beginning to feel less intimidating. One evening, as I sat at my computer, I found myself scrolling through an online dating site. It had been years since I'd even considered something like this, and the whole process felt foreign. But after reading a few profiles and seeing how many people were in similar situations, divorced, single parents, looking for companionship, I began to feel more comfortable with the idea. I spent a couple of days working on my profile, trying to strike the right balance between honesty and optimism. I didn't want to come across as jaded or cynical, but I also didn't want to pretend like I hadn't been through some difficult times. In the end, I wrote something simple, focusing on who I was now, not who I had been in the past. A week later, I received my first message. Her name was Rachel. She was a teacher, recently divorced, with 2 teenage kids. Her profile was thoughtful, filled with humor and kindness, and her message to me was equally warm. We exchanged a few more messages over the course of a week, and eventually, I worked up the nerve to ask her out for coffee. Our first date was easy, comfortable. We met at a small cafe in town, and from the moment we started talking, it felt like we had known each other for years. We talked about everything: our kids, our divorces, our hopes for the future. There was an instant connection, a sense that we understood each other in ways that only people who had been through similar experiences could. Rachel was smart, funny, and had a warmth about her that put me at ease. By the end of the evening, I knew I wanted to see her again. And when she smiled and agreed to a second date, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in years. Over the next few months, Rachel and I grew closer. We took things slowly, both of us cautious after the wounds left by our divorces. But as we spent more time together, I realized that I was beginning to care for her deeply. She had a way of making me laugh, of making me feel at ease, that I hadn't experienced in a long time. One evening, as we sat on the couch in her living room, watching a movie, Rachel turned to me, her eyes serious. "Tom, I need to ask you something," she said, her voice soft. I muted the TV, sensing the importance of what she was about to say. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. "Do you see a future with me? I mean, I know we've both been through a lot, and I don't want to rush things, but I care about you, and I just want to know if we're on the same page." Her question took me by surprise, but as I looked at her, I realized I had already been thinking about the same thing. Over the past few months, my feelings for Rachel had grown stronger, and I couldn't deny that I saw a future with her. But I also knew that after everything I had been through, I needed to be sure. "I do see a future with you, Rachel," I said honestly. "I care about you a lot, but I also want to make sure we take our time. I don't want to rush into anything and risk hurting each other." She nodded, relief washing over her face. "I'm glad you said that. I feel the same way. I didn't want to assume anything." I smiled, taking her hand in mine. "We'll figure it out together, one step at a time." From that moment on, our relationship deepened. We spent more time together, blending our families slowly. Evelyn, ever the supportive daughter, was happy to see me moving forward. She met Rachel a few times, and the two of them got along well, which only reassured me that I was on the right path. But as with any relationship, there were challenges. One evening, as we were having dinner at my place, Rachel brought up a topic that had been weighing on her mind. "Tom," she began, her voice hesitant, "I know we've talked about taking things slow, but there's something I need to know." I set down my fork, sensing the seriousness of her tone. "What is it?" She glanced down at her plate before looking back up at me. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, about us, and I need to know if you ever see us getting married. Not now, of course, but someday." The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Marriage. It wasn't something I had allowed myself to think about in a long time. After Sarah, I wasn't sure if I could ever go down that road again. But Rachel deserved an honest answer, and I owed it to both of us to consider it carefully. "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead, but I do know that I care about you deeply, and I want to see where this goes. I don't want to close any doors, but I also want to make sure we're both ready before we take that step." Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I understand. I'm not in a rush either, but I just wanted to know if it was something you'd be open to. I am, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. I just need time. We both do. She smiled, her fingers curling around mine. That's all I needed to hear. From that point on, our relationship grew stronger. We navigated the ups and downs together, supporting each other through the challenges that life threw our way. There were moments of doubt, moments where I questioned whether I was ready for this level of commitment again, but Rachel's patience and understanding always brought me back. As the months turned into a year, I found myself contemplating the future more and more. Could I see myself spending the rest of my life with Rachel? The answer, more often than not, was yes. She had become a central part of my life, someone I could rely on, someone I loved. One evening, as we sat on my porch, watching the sunset, I turned to her, my heart full. Rachel, I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion. I've been thinking about us, about the future, and I think I'm ready. She looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise. Ready for what? For whatever comes next, I said, smiling. Whether it's marriage or something else, I'm ready to take that step with you. Her smile was radiant, her eyes filling with tears of joy. Oh, Tom, I've been waiting to hear that. We embraced, the warmth of our connection wrapping around us like a blanket. In that moment, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together. The next few weeks were filled with excitement as we started making plans for our future. We didn't rush into anything, but the possibility of marriage was on the horizon, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with the idea. Evelyn, of course, was thrilled. She had always been my biggest supporter, and seeing me happy made her happy. As the months passed, Rachel and I grew even closer, our bond deepening with every challenge we faced together. And when the day finally came that I got down on one knee and asked her to marry me, she didn't hesitate for a second before saying yes. The months leading up to my proposal to Rachel felt like a whirlwind of emotions. Yet for the first time in years, everything seemed to be falling into place. After the initial rush of excitement that followed our engagement, we both settled into the quiet joy of planning a life together. Neither of us wanted a big wedding. After all, we had both been married before, and what mattered now wasn't the grandeur of a ceremony but the meaning behind it. We decided on something small and intimate, with just close family and friends. Evelyn, of course, was thrilled when I shared the news of the engagement with her. She immediately launched into planning mode, offering to help with everything from finding the perfect venue to choosing flowers. Watching her excitement was heartwarming, especially since she had been my biggest supporter through it all. Seeing her so genuinely happy for me felt like a victory, one I never could have imagined in the years after my divorce from Sarah. Dad, this is going to be amazing. Evelyn beamed one afternoon while we sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by wedding magazines and printouts from various venues. Rachel is wonderful, and I'm so happy for both of you. I smiled at my daughter, her enthusiasm infectious. Thanks, sweetheart. I never thought I'd be here again, planning a wedding, but I'm glad it's happening. Rachel and we're a good fit. You're more than a good fit, Evelyn said with a wink. You're perfect for each other. We spent hours that weekend going over ideas, discussing everything from catering options to the guest list. While we wanted to keep it small, there were still a lot of decisions to make, and Evelyn's input was invaluable. She had an eye for detail, and I trusted her judgment, just as I had with so many things over the years. As the planning progressed, Rachel and I grew even closer. The process of building a life together, of making these decisions as a team, only reinforced the strength of our relationship. There was no rush, no pressure to impress anyone. We were simply doing what felt right for us. Rachel's 2 children, Liam and Sophie, were equally excited. Though they were teenagers, they had warmed to me over time, and by now, we had a comfortable, blended family dynamic. Liam was 17 and preparing for his senior year of high school, while Sophie, at 15, was already talking about her college plans. They had both been through their own version of the emotional roller coaster that comes with parents divorcing and remarrying, but they seemed to have come out of it with resilience and a strong bond with their mom. One evening, as we all sat around the dinner table, Sophie looked up from her plate and asked, "Tom, when's the wedding going to be?" Rachel laughed, glancing at me. Sophie, We haven't even picked a date yet. There's still so much to figure out. Well, I hope it's soon, Sophie said with a grin. I want to wear a pretty dress. Liam rolled his eyes but smiled. Yeah, I'll go along with whatever as long as I don't have to wear a tux. You'll be in a suit, Rachel teased. Don't worry, it'll be painless. The conversation flowed naturally, the laughter easy, and as I looked around the table, I realized just how lucky I was. Not just to have found love again with Rachel, but to be a part of this blended family. It wasn't something I had ever expected, but it was everything I hadn't known I needed. As the months passed, the wedding date was set for a quiet fall afternoon, just before the leaves would start turning colors. We found a small venue outside the city, a charming garden with a rustic barn for the reception. It was perfect, simple, and beautiful, just like our love story. Evelyn, who had taken charge of many of the details, made sure everything was in place. She even helped Liam and Sophie choose their outfits for the big day, making them feel involved in the process. Watching her step into this role with such grace and enthusiasm made me realize just how much she had grown. It wasn't just that she was older now. It was that she had become this incredibly thoughtful, compassionate person who wanted the best for everyone around her. I couldn't have been prouder. The night before the wedding, we held a small rehearsal dinner at my house, with just immediate family and a few close friends. As we sat around the dining table, toasting to the future, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come since my divorce. There was a time when I couldn't imagine trusting anyone again, let alone finding love. But life, it seemed, had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Rachel and I sat together on the porch, watching the stars twinkle in the clear night sky. "Can you believe we're getting married tomorrow?" she asked, leaning her head on my shoulder. "I can," I said, smiling. "It feels right." She sighed happily, her hand resting on mine. "It does, doesn't it? I never thought I'd get a second chance at this." "Neither did I admitted. "But I'm glad we did." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the gentle rustle of the wind in the trees. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt like the calm before the beautiful storm of the next day. The wedding day arrived with the kind of perfect weather you hope for but rarely get. The sun was shining, the temperature was just right, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. As the guests began to arrive, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. But as soon as I saw Rachel walking down the aisle, all my worries melted away. She looked stunning, her eyes shining with happiness as she walked toward me, hand in hand with Liam and Sophie on either side of her. Evelyn stood beside me as my best woman, her smile radiating pride and joy. I couldn't have asked for a better support system. As I looked around at the small gathering of people who mattered most to us, I realized just how lucky I was to have found not just love, but family. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. We exchanged vows that we had written ourselves, promising to support each other through whatever life might throw our way. There were tears, happy tears, mostly, and laughter as we shared stories about how we met and the journey that had brought us to this moment. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, I felt a rush of emotion that I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about marrying Rachel. It was about everything that had come before. The struggles, the heartache, the uncertainty. It all led to this moment, to the life we were now building together. The reception that followed was filled with laughter and love. The barn had been beautifully decorated with twinkling lights, and the tables were adorned with simple flower arrangements that Evelyn had helped choose. We danced, we ate, and we celebrated with the people who had been there for us through thick and thin. As the evening wound down, Rachel and I snuck away for a quiet moment alone. We stood just outside the barn, looking out over the garden, the soft glow of the lights casting a warm hue over everything. "I can't believe we did it," Rachel said, her voice soft with awe. "We're married." I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close. "We did, and it feels perfect." She smiled up at me, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I love you, Tom." "I love you too," I whispered, kissing her gently. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. We had come through so much to get here, and now, standing on the other side, I realized that all of it had been worth it. Life had a way of surprising you, of giving you second chances when you least expected them. The weeks after the wedding flew by in a blur of contentment. Rachel and I settled into married life with ease, our blended family finding a rhythm that worked for all of us. Liam and Sophie were preparing for their next steps in life. Liam for college, and Sophie for her last few years of high school, and Evelyn was thriving in her final year of veterinary school. Everything felt right. One afternoon, about 2 months after the wedding, I received a phone call that I hadn't expected. It was Sarah. "Hi, Tom," she said, her voice tentative. "I hope this isn't a bad time." I hadn't spoken to Sarah much since our divorce, aside from the occasional conversation about Evelyn. It had been years since we had any kind of meaningful interaction, and her call caught me off guard. "No, it's fine," I replied, unsure of where this was going. "What's up?" There was a pause on the other end before she spoke again. "I just wanted to congratulate you. Evelyn told me about the wedding. I'm glad you found someone who makes you happy." Her words were sincere, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that." She sighed, the sound heavy with emotion. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About the past, about our marriage. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know I hurt you, and I've regretted it for a long time." Her apology, though unexpected, felt genuine. And while I had made peace with what had happened between us years ago, hearing her say it aloud was like closing a door that had been left slightly ajar for too long. "I appreciate that, Sarah," I said softly. "It's been a long time, but we've both moved on. I'm happy now, and I hope you are too." She was quiet for a moment before responding. "I am, but I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. You deserved better." "I think we both learned a lot from our mistakes," I said. "And in the end, I think it's made us stronger." "Yeah," she agreed, her voice thoughtful. "Take care of yourself, Tom, and take care of Evelyn." "I will," I promised. "You too." After we hung up, I sat there for a while, reflecting on the conversation. It was strange how life worked. The people who had once been the center of your world could drift away, and yet, there was still room for forgiveness and understanding. As I walked into the living room, Rachel looked up from her book, smiling when she saw me. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, sitting down beside her. "Just an unexpected phone call." "Sarah called." Rachel raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Oh, what did she want?" I shrugged, leaning back into the couch. "She wanted to apologize. For everything." Rachel smiled softly, resting her head on my shoulder. "That's big of her." "Yeah," I agreed. "It feels like closure, you know? Like everything has finally come full circle." She squeezed my hand. "I'm glad, Tom. You deserve that." And she was right. After all these years, after all the ups and downs, I had finally reached a place where I could look back without any bitterness or regret. Life wasn't perfect, it never was, but it was good, and I was happy. Rachel and I continued to build our life together, supporting each other through the challenges that came our way. We traveled, we laughed, and we loved deeply. And through it all, I knew that this was the life I was meant to live. As time passed, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. After years of uncertainty, heartbreak, and rebuilding, I finally felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Rachel and I had found our stride as a married couple, and our blended family was thriving in ways I had never imagined possible.